Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I wanted to talk a bit more about Satan's Little Season and talk a little bit about the theories where when it comes to like glorified saints and those who don't have glorified bodies already. Remember, I talked about this in a previous video about how it might look like in terms of glorified saints and then like those who die without glorified bodies, like the difference between them because they're both in the third heaven. What is one group doing? What is the other? Well, I think I came up with an answer to this. Now, this is all speculative. It's just a theory, but it seems to make sense. Now, there's no biblical support for this, but it's just an idea I had, so I want to share it. And you know how First Corinthians chapter 13:12 it says, "For now we see through a glass darkly." So we don't have all the answers, but it is fun to speculate about these things on how it might look like. But what I'm thinking is because here's the thing, just as a general concept, when you're in the third heaven, you don't need a glorified physical body because it's not the physical realm. That's the spiritual realm. When you're here on earth, we need physical bodies because we're on the physical earth. This is the physical realm. Likewise, when the new earth happens, we're all going to need, all the saints are going to need glorified bodies because there's going to be a physical new earth. However, if you're up in the third heaven, you don't need that. So where I'm going with this is I believe I believe that the glorified saints, when they were traveling, like during the millennial kingdom, back and forth from the third heaven to the earth, the physical earth, I believe that their bodies were like transforming, like for that purpose. So it makes a lot of sense, right? So when they're up in the third heaven, those who don't have glorified bodies yet, who never received glorified bodies, they're up in the third heaven constantly, right? Like they're in heaven, their souls are in heaven, they're doing stuff, whatever. Now, these saints who are reigning on earth, the reason they have glorified bodies is for the purpose of reigning on earth. That's the whole purpose, right? Because they wouldn't need glorified bodies if they weren't reigning on earth, right? So that's when that rapture happened, like when they receive the glorified bodies. I call it a rapture, you could resurrection, whatever you want to call it. But when that happened and they received the glorified bodies, that was for the sole purpose of reigning on the physical earth. Because you don't have to have that when you're in the third heaven. So that makes a lot of sense, right? So and that's for their own protection, right? Because during the millennial kingdom, there's still like death and things like that. There were still, you know what I'm saying? So these glorified bodies, I believe, like it protected them from that, from the harsh environments. Now, obviously, on New Earth, we won't need that. Everything's gonna be perfect. So I don't know. I don't know how that's going to look like on New Earth or anything. Maybe when we reign, maybe it's going to be the same concept just because I don't know all those things. Like maybe when we come down on New Earth and we travel back and forth, our bodies will transform. Like when we reign, because the same thing will happen. I think we'll reign over nations on New Earth, and then our bodies will transform while we're reigning on the earth. And when we're coming up to the third heaven, it'll come back to the spiritual body. But anyways, let's not get into that. But point of the matter is that I think for the purpose of reigning on earth, they needed glorified bodies. And so during this time in the millennial kingdom, when they went up to the third heaven, their bodies transform back to a spiritual body, a spiritual state, just like those who don't have glorified bodies. And then when they came down to do work on New Earth, it transformed into a glorified body, into a glorified state for that purpose, right? So see how so that's what I think it is. I don't know for sure, but doesn't that make sense? Because now that explains the answer of like, isn't there some inequality in heaven now? Some with glorified bodies, some without? No, there isn't, right? Because they're in the third heaven. This is the spiritual realm. So when they're up there, their bodies are back to the spiritual, like their spiritual state, their spiritual bodies, just like the saints who didn't receive glorified bodies yet, who simply died and went to heaven and didn't have the glorified bodies, right? Like everyone else who's now in the third heaven. So they're all doing the same thing. They're in the same state, in the same spiritual form, all of them. The glorified saints who reigned, as well as those who, all of the saints since the beginning of time, who don't have glorified bodies, which would be those who died after, which we know now after the millennial kingdom, who are saints, right? They would all be in the same, they had all have the same spiritual bodies in the same state because they are all in the third heaven, right? They're all sharing the same space in the spiritual realm up in the third heaven, right? So that makes sense. And then when they come back down on earth during the millennial kingdom, like the actual glorified saints, during that time, their bodies would transform into the glorified bodies for the on the physical earth. Doesn't that seem to make sense? I'm not saying it's for sure, but that kind of explains that answer, right? And then also, imagine like now, given that, imagine the wicked souls, like the lost people who are still confined in this earth, in that what I talked about before in my previous video, in hell, right, in the spiritual realm, and they're confined in this earth and they don't have glorified bodies. So can you imagine? That's probably why it's also tormenting for them. Also, I think like that's why there's torment, probably because they're missing. They're they're supposed to have like glorified bodies, but they don't, and they're still confined to the earth. They're not even in the third heaven. They're separated from God, and they're like, you know what I'm saying? So they're still in the in that's what hell is, I think, right? And they're still in that hellish realm, right? The demonic realm, spiritual realm, and they're trapped. They don't have bodies for the wicked souls. So that makes sense when it comes to that, right? But and then also like souls, yeah, and exactly, and souls in third heaven, they don't need glorified bodies, right? So even those who reigned, who had glorified bodies, probably now in the third heaven, like I said, they're just like the rest of the saints who died after the millennial kingdom. They're just in the same spiritual body, the same exact state. So that makes so much sense when you look at it that way. And then for the sole purpose of doing work here on earth and like for reigning over nations, that's when they receive glorified bodies. And then in a philosophical in a philosophical sense, it also makes sense why we're in this physical, like just being born into this world. We have obviously physical bodies and things like that because we're made for a purpose to do work here on this earth, right? But that's kind of going into the weeds a bit. But like in terms of in terms of like these glorified saints who reigned, that makes so much sense, right? Because the earth was still here, they needed glorified bodies. So once they were coming down, they were their spiritual bodies transformed into glorified physical bodies. So that's kind of interesting. It's neat. That's sort of what came to me last night, and I'm wondering what you guys think about it. I think we might be onto something there when it comes to that. It fits scripturally as well. And again, but like I mean, it fits with obviously what we know about needing glorified bodies and stuff like that. But we don't know that this is. It doesn't say scripturally that it does transform or anything. It's just an idea. But it makes sense, right? Doesn't that make sense? And then also, just like on New Earth, right? Just like on New Earth, when we receive glorified bodies, I think the same thing. We'll probably be transforming from that I don't know, to be honest. Like because heaven and earth, it comes, third heaven comes down and stuff like that. Maybe we won't even we'll always be physical, but I think there'll still be like a third heaven, maybe. So we still might be traveling just like the other saints did before us. And so when we're up in the third heaven, maybe the physical body will just be into a spiritual state, like a spiritual body, and then when we come down to New Earth to do work down on New Earth, reign over nations or do whatever, then it transforms into a physical body as well, a glorified body. So I don't know, but that would make a lot of sense. So, but yeah, let me know what you guys think. Seems to make a lot of sense that that's the case, and that answers that question I had before. And so yeah, I think we're getting somewhere here. So, all right, God bless.